I should have seen it coming. The dismissive digs and glances, how she always put me in my place. But nothing prepared me for the moment she snapped her fingers at me, like I was some obedient pet. My face burned, and something inside me broke. 3 years of being treated like the family servant had finally reached its breaking point. I wasn't just angry. I was done. This was the final straw. It was time to pull the trigger, and they had no clue what was coming. My name is Lily Carson, and this is the story of how I went from being the family's doormat to the most powerful person in my husband's family. "Lily, the bathroom needs cleaning again." My mother-in-law Margaret's voice echoed through the 2-story colonial we shared in suburban Michigan. I was already elbow-deep in dishwater, tackling the mountain of plates from the dinner I had cooked for 7 people, none of whom had offered to help. I closed my eyes and counted to 10. This wasn't what I signed up for when I married David 3 years ago. Back then, living with his parents was supposed to be temporary, just 6 months while we saved for a down payment on our own place. But 6 months turned into a year, then 2, then 3. And somehow, during that time, I'd gone from being David's wife to the family's unpaid housekeeper. "Coming, Margaret," I called back, drying my hands on a kitchen towel emblazoned with Carson family in fancy script. A Christmas gift from my in-laws that now felt like a brand of ownership. I trudged up the carpeted stairs of their Bloomfield Hills home, passing the family photos that lined the wall. Pictures of David growing up, his sister Melissa's wedding, various Carson family vacations to Mackinac Island in Florida. Not a single photo of our wedding day among them. When I reached the main bathroom, Margaret stood in the doorway in her Talbot's cardigan and perfectly pressed khakis, pointing at the shower. "There's still soap scum on the glass doors. I've told you before how important it is to squeegee after every shower." She handed me a bottle of Tilex. "Make sure you get all the grout lines this time." I nodded, swallowing the angry words that threatened to spill out. At 32 years old, with a master's degree in library science and a full-time job at the Detroit Public Library, I was being lectured about cleaning techniques like a child. "I have a meeting with the garden club in an hour," Margaret continued, checking her Apple Watch. "Oh, and we're having the Hendersons over for brunch on Sunday. Plan for something impressive, will you? Last time your quiche was a little too simple." That's when she did it. As she turned to leave, she snapped her fingers at me without even looking back, like I was the family golden retriever instead of her daughter-in-law. Something inside me shattered. I cleaned that bathroom until it sparkled, but my mind was elsewhere. 3 years of subtle put-downs, increasing demands, and my husband's constant refrain. "That's just how Mom is, Lily. Don't take it personally." 3 years of watching David's father, Richard, sit in his lazy boy recliner, expecting dinner at exactly 6:30 p.m., never once thanking me for cooking. 3 years of his sister Melissa dropping off her laundry because Lily does such a good job with stains. As I scrubbed, a plan began to form in my mind. The Carsons had power over me because they had power over David. And they had power over David because of one thing: money. The family business, Carson Property Management, had been promised to David since he was a child. His father dangled it like a carrot, keeping David compliant with reminders of his legacy and responsibility to the family. It was why we lived with them, why David worked 60-hour weeks for half what he was worth, and why I'd become the family doormat. But what the Carsons didn't know was that I had been keeping track of everything. And I meant everything. Sunday brunch with the Hendersons was the final straw. I'd spent all Saturday preparing, making everything from scratch. Maple-glazed bacon, fresh blueberry compote for Belgian waffles, a spinach and goat cheese strata, fresh squeezed orange juice, and a tiered fruit display that belonged in a magazine. The Hendersons, Richard's golfing buddies and potential business partners, were clearly impressed. "Margaret, this spread is incredible," Janet Henderson exclaimed, helping herself to seconds of the strata. My mother-in-law smiled graciously. "Thank you. I've always believed in making an effort for special occasions." I nearly dropped the coffee carafe I was carrying. She was taking credit for my work. Again. "Actually," I started to say, but Margaret cut me off smoothly. "Lily, be a dear and bring out more of those little pastries from the kitchen." I caught David's eye across the table, silently pleading for him to say something. anything to acknowledge my efforts. He looked away, suddenly very interested in his napkin. Back in the kitchen, I gripped the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. This wasn't just about brunch. This was about 3 years of invisibility. 3 years of Lily be a dear and 3 years of David choosing his parents' approval over his wife's dignity. When I returned with the pastries, the conversation had turned to business. "So, we're all set for the Riverside development?" Tom Henderson was asking. "The city council approved the zoning changes?" Richard nodded confidently. "All taken care of. We've got people in the right places. That property will triple in value once we break ground next month." I froze, pastry tray in hand. The Riverside development was a controversial project in a historically black neighborhood in Detroit. The city had been fighting against gentrification that would push out longtime residents. And here was my father-in-law, basically admitting to corruption. For the rest of brunch, I served and cleared and smiled, all while recording the conversation on my phone in my apron pocket. By the time the Hendersons left, I had enough to begin my plan. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee. It was time to teach the Carsons what it meant to be powerless. Over the next 2 weeks, I became the perfect daughter-in-law. I cleaned without being asked. I prepared Richard's favorite pot roast. I helped Margaret organize her charity auction paperwork. I was pleasant, helpful, and completely invisible. Exactly what they wanted. But at night, I worked. The Carson family business had secrets. Working in a library had taught me how to research, and living in their house gave me access to everything. Tax documents carelessly left on Richard's home office desk, emails left open on the family computer, conversations overheard during dinner parties. I methodically documented it all. The zoning bribes, the illegal immigrant laborers paid under the table, the building code violations covered up with strategic gifts to inspectors, the missing tax payments, the discriminatory rental practices. Then there was Margaret's Garden Club, a cover for her real hobby, spreading vicious gossip about everyone in their social circle, including the Hendersons. I had recordings, text messages she'd sent me to send to others on her behalf, and notes from her private address book that she'd made me update. The hardest part was David, my husband, the man I had once loved enough to endure all this. Going through his things felt like a betrayal. But when I found evidence that he'd known about the business practices all along, had even participated in some of them, something hardened in my heart. It was time. Time to take action. I requested a week off from the library, telling my boss I needed personal time. Then I told the Carsons I had a conference in Chicago. Instead, I rented an apartment across town with the money I'd been secretly saving. I moved my most precious belongings there while everyone was at work, and I prepared 3 identical USB drives with all the evidence I'd collected. The morning I was supposed to leave for my conference, I walked into the dining room during breakfast where the entire family was gathered. "Lily, don't forget to water the orchids before you go," Margaret said without looking up from her toast. "Last time they nearly died." I placed a manila envelope in the center of the table. "What's this?" Richard asked, frowning. "My resignation," I said calmly. That got their attention. 4 pairs of eyes stared at me in confusion. "Your what?" David finally asked. "My resignation as the family maid, cook, gardener, secretary, and emotional punching bag?" My voice was steady, even as my heart pounded. "Inside that envelope are copies of documents that I think would interest a lot of people. The IRS, the Detroit Free Press, the City Housing Authority, the FBI's Public Corruption Division." Richard's face turned an alarming shade of red. "How dare you?" I held up my hand. "I'm not finished." For once, he stopped talking. "For 3 years, I've been treated like I'm nothing in this house, snapped at like a dog." I looked directly at Margaret, whose face had gone pale. "Worked like an unpaid servant." I shifted my gaze to Richard, ignored and dismissed. This was for Melissa. And betrayed. Finally, I looked at my husband, whose expression was a mixture of shock and fear. "So here's what's going to happen," I continued. "I'm moving out today. I've already packed my things." "Lily, you're being ridiculous," David started. "Am I?" I pulled out my phone and played a recording of Richard discussing the bribes for the Riverside development, because I think the FBI might disagree. The room went deadly silent. And Margaret, I added, I also have recordings of you saying all those nasty things about your supposed friends. I'll be happy to help you share them with everyone on your phone list. Margaret's face instantly turned bright red as she imagined how that would affect her reputation and her life thereafter. They were quiet for a while, perhaps thinking about what prison would be like. You wouldn't, Richard finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. 3 years ago, no, I wouldn't have. But you all taught me something important. Power matters. And right now, I have it. What do you want? Margaret whispered. I smiled for the first time. I thought you'd never ask. First, David and I are getting our own place, today. The family will provide the down payment as a belated wedding gift. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off. Second, the Riverside development is dead. You're going to sell that property to a community land trust at cost. I've already spoken with them, and they're expecting your call. That's millions in lost profit, Richard shouted. Third, I continued as if he hadn't spoken, Carson Property Management will implement fair housing practices and pay proper wages to all workers with benefits. I've drafted a new company policy. I pulled another document from my bag and placed it next to the envelope. And finally, I turned to David, whose face had gone from shocked to calculating. He was already trying to figure a way out. My husband is going to decide right now where his loyalty lies, with his family's corrupt business or with his wife and basic human decency. The room erupted in chaos. Richard threatened to call the police. Margaret burst into tears. Melissa started texting frantically, probably calling reinforcements. Only David remained silent, staring at me like he'd never seen me before. You have 24 hours to decide, I said, picking up my purse. If I don't hear from you by then, copies of everything go to the authorities. And trust me, I've taken precautions. Even if something happens to me, the information gets out. I walked to the door, then turned back one last time. Oh, and Margaret, one last thing. Yes, she said hopefully. Clean your own damn bathroom. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I sat in my sparsely furnished rental apartment, surrounded by the few boxes of belongings I'd brought, jumping every time my phone buzzed. My hands shook as I made tea in an unfamiliar kitchen. What if I'd miscalculated? What if they called my bluff? But I hadn't miscalculated. I knew the Carsons too well. Their reputation, their social standing, their business, these things meant everything to them. At hour 23, my phone rang. David's name flashed on the screen. Hello? My voice was barely a whisper. We need to talk, he said. Not over the phone. Can I come to you? I gave him the address with shaking hands. 30 minutes later, a knock at the door. David stood there, looking like he hadn't slept. Behind him was a U-Haul truck. I brought your things, he said simply. And? I held my breath. He handed me a folder. The deed to the house on Maple Street, the one you always liked when we drove by. Dad signed it over this morning as a gift. I flipped through the papers, disbelieving. The beautiful futuristic home within an amazing garden and huge pool, and reading nook in the master bedroom. It was really ours. The Riverside development? I asked. Dad's meeting with the land trust tomorrow. He's not happy about it, but he's doing it. And the business practices? David looked down. That's complicated. But we've started. New hiring policies are being written up. Wage increases across the board. He looked up at me. It'll take time, but it's happening. I nodded slowly. And us? Where do we stand? This was the real question. Through all of this, I hadn't been sure what I wanted from David. Did I still love him? Could I forgive his complicity? Did I even want to try? I don't know, he admitted. I've been a coward, Lily. I let them treat you terribly because it was easier than standing up to them. I've let Dad run my life because it was easier than making my own way. He ran a hand through his hair. I don't deserve another chance, but if you're willing to give me one, I promise things will be different. Not just with my parents, but with us, with the business, with everything. I studied his face, looking for signs of the man I'd fallen in love with years ago, before his parents had poisoned everything. I can't make any promises, I said finally, but I'm willing to try, on neutral ground. I nodded toward the papers. Our house, not theirs, and couples counseling non-negotiable. Agreed, he said immediately. Whatever it takes. I stepped back to let him in. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The house on Maple Street looked like something from a magazine spread. It was super modern, huge. Bookshelves lined the walls of our living room, filled with my beloved collection. Sunlight streamed through the huge glass windows, warming the hardwood floors. In the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee mingled with baking bread. And for once, I was making it because I wanted to, not because I was expected to. The doorbell rang. "I'll get it," David called from his home office, where he was working on the new employee benefits package for Carson Property Management. I heard murmured voices. Then David appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Your guests are here." Margaret and Richard stood awkwardly behind him, looking smaller somehow in my home. Margaret clutched a houseplant, a peace lily, like a shield. Richard held a bottle of wine. "Come in," I said, wiping my hands on a towel. "Coffee's fresh." This was their first visit to our house. The terms of our truce had been clear. I kept the evidence as insurance, they respected our boundaries, and we would slowly, cautiously, try to rebuild some kind of relationship. Margaret placed the plant on the counter. "I thought it might brighten up your kitchen," she said stiffly. I nodded. "Thank you, it's lovely." Richard cleared his throat. The Community Land Trust breaks ground next week. They've invited us to the ceremony." "Us?" I raised an eyebrow. "The whole family, including you." He looked uncomfortable but pushed through. "It was their idea. Apparently your name came up when they were discussing their negotiations with us." I hid a smile. I'd had several long conversations with the land trust director before confronting the Carsons. She was a formidable woman who had been fighting gentrification for decades. "I'd be honored to attend," I said. As I poured coffee into my grandmother's teacups, not Margaret's china, I caught David watching me with something like pride in his eyes. Our relationship was still healing. The couples counselor said it would take time, but it was built on honesty now. Real honesty, not the facade of family harmony the Carsons had maintained for years. Richard took a tentative sip of coffee. "This is good," he said, sounding surprised. "Lily's always made excellent coffee," David said pointedly, among many other things. Margaret flinched slightly but nodded. "Yes, she has." It wasn't a grand apology. There were no tearful confessions or dramatic reconciliations. The Carsons weren't built that way, but it was acknowledgement. It was respect. And for now, that was enough. As we moved to the dining room for brunch, one I'd prepared because I wanted to, not because I had to, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. I stood straighter now, spoke more confidently, met my in-laws' eyes without flinching. I wasn't powerless anymore, and neither were they. Perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. True power isn't about controlling others. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. It's about setting boundaries and demanding respect. And sometimes it's about finding the strength to start over, whether that means forgiving those who've wronged you or walking away from those who never will. Either way, the choice was finally mine. Hope you enjoyed Lily's story. Have you ever had major issues over how you've been treated? Drop your wildest stories in the comments, or just comment about Lily's tale. What would you say to Margaret? Did David deserve a second chance? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more real-life stories you won't forget in a hurry.